joining our panel today. We're talking about how AAPI storytellers challenge norms and uplift unheard voices. My name is Chloe Tai, and I'll be moderating. I currently work as a political producer at Spectrum News New York One on the nightly program Inside City Hall. I'm also a board director of the Asian American Journalists Association, the New York chapter, and we were also a co-sponsor of today's our conference, so thank you for joining us. AAJA has been advancing diversity in newsroom for over 40 years and has more than 1,500 members. And today we are lucky to hear from 3 different journalists who have all accomplished careers in telling stories about the AAPI communities. There's also going to be a Q&A portion at the end, so hold your questions for that. And can I ask each of the journalists to start by introducing themselves? Azadeh, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Azadeh Valanejad. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Envi Media. Before that, I was at Condé Nast as a video producer and writer for a number of publications, including Vanity Fair, Glamour, Allure. And my passion within journalism really comes from building community and uplifting women creatives in the media space.
Thank you. Keshia?
Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all here. My name is Keshia Hannam. I'm originally from Hong Kong. My mother is Indian, my father is English. I went to school in Australia, so I'm very confused. Probably like many people here, we probably share that in common. But I'm very grateful to be the editor-in-chief of Eastern Standard Times, which is a publication that was created in 2020 to represent Asia and the Asian diaspora. And like me, and I'm sure many of you, we hope to build bridges between the East and West. So we tell 50% of our stories from Asia and 50% of our stories throughout the diaspora.
And Tina?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tina Wen. I'm the journalist covering underrepresented communities. Currently, I'm the president of AAJA New York. Born and raised in China, I came to the U.S. Around 18, and I covered the DEI community since then.
Thank you all for joining us. So my first question is for Azadeh. Do you just introduce a little bit about Envi Media? So why did you decide to transform a fan project into a media publication dedicated to underrepresented communities? And what were you hoping to accomplish with its creation?
Yeah, so Envi Media, for those who are unfamiliar, we cover culture and entertainment across the Asian diaspora. We started in the middle of the pandemic in 2020 after I had been laid off. And through a lot of my work at Condé Nast, I worked with a lot of API talent and celebrities. And their fans had connected with me on social media. A lot of them were aspiring journalists, and they would reach out to me asking, how can I get my foot in the door? How can, I move forward with my career? And I would kind of try to connect them with editors and writers at publications I knew. And oftentimes they would come back to me and they would say that they got a straight no, there was gatekeeping, or the pitches that they sent in were taken from them. And I just got really frustrated. I was like, we cannot wait for these legacy publications to pass the pen. We're going to do it ourselves. So that's kind of where Envi came from. And we're almost 5 years old. We have about 70 contributors. We're primarily women of color. And our goal has always been to have our audience feel seen, heard, and represented. And I think we do a good job of that because it's represented within our own team.
Thank you. And I have a question for Keshia on Eastern Standard Times Media. It was created to uplift voices from Asia and the Asian diaspora. As an editor-in-chief, what kind of stories are you looking for when authors pitch you ideas?
So I started my media career in Hong Kong, where I was working for a number of different publications, CNN, Nat Geo, Forbes, Fortune, Time, etc. And I was consistently frustrated that stories that I knew were resonant with our community in our city were constantly denied by the editors who usually were not from Hong Kong. And if you think about any of the largest media publications, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, the Guardian, they're all from the UK and the US. And so not with any negative intention, but naturally there will be bias to the way that people tell stories. So the way that Eastern Standard Times was created was to be a voice for Asia from Asia. So one of the main ways that we try to do that is by not flying anyone anywhere. You know, we don't do I had to fly to Iraq to find out what was really happening. You know, like we'll just ask people what's happening on the ground there. So that means that we work with, if we're working on a Vietnamese story, we work with a Vietnamese crew. If we're working on a story about China, mainland China, we'll work with a crew in Beijing. The intention is always to let people tell their own stories, which sort of inverts the model of correspondence.
That's really great. I feel like there's a trend here where you guys wanted to tell your own stories and really have it told from the perspective of you guys. So, Tina, for you, I had a question. As a journalist covering underrepresented communities for publications like Elle, HuffPost, Time, Joy Sauce, what do you perceive as the biggest obstacles to exerting influence and igniting conversations? And is it hard to get mainstream media to treat stories about the AAPI community seriously?
Yeah, of course. I think it's always people are talking about API stories as very niche, and it's very hard, to pitch those stories in those mainstream media. I believe Keshia and Azadeh can speak to that later as well. Because take me for example, I write a lot about API communities, and then recently I pitched a story for a fashion legacy brand, and then it waited for 5 months till May to be published. So this kind of stuff happen all the time, where you really have to strive hard to make it to the point to the editor why this story can exist beyond the AEPI month. So I think this is also a reminder for a lot of writers in the room. I know there's some of them. So it's really about how do you make the angle to editors when you're pitching the stories, why this is important, why this is timely beyond a certain time. And I think for a lot of us, it's really important to make it heard. You know, if we don't ever write about this, maybe nobody will. So yeah.
Thank you. So kind of pivoting, Azadeh, your Envi Media does not just deal with print, it is also focused on multimedia. So you've also contributed to long-form video projects as part of your work with Vanity Fair and Glamour. How do you utilize these different mediums to forward your stories? And do you think different mediums tell different stories?
For sure. So I think it's important to use different mediums, especially today, because when you think of the audience, some people prefer reading long form articles, others prefer. Can you hear me? Okay. Others prefer video, and then there's a large population now that they really just want bite-sized content, right? So that could be a social video or just through graphics and whatnot. So throughout my whole career, that's kind of been, I feel like, because I started within video, specifically social video, that's something I've always been aware of. So we've kind of brought that into Envy. And to reach a wider audience and to try to beat all these algorithms, right, and get the stories that we're trying to tell across. So, for example, if we're doing a small business spotlight on an API business, right, we might do a documentary style video for YouTube, also write an article, cut it for socials. And within all of that, we'll say, go and read the article because there's going to be different information in there, or, make sure to watch the full video. This way, we are making it also more accessible, which I think is very important, and a little bit more community driven.
Thank you. Yeah, I think accessibility is a really big deal. So like going to that, Keshia, for Eastern Standard Time's platform, you guys have featured like a lot of documentaries on it. In this oversaturated environment, how do you market yourselves to cut through the noise and promote your content to the audience?
Yeah, as Azadeh mentions, it's so challenging, right? I'm sure you've all experienced it. You'll spend hours working on something and you'll release it and it'll get couple thousand views, couple hundred views, whatever. There's a number of ways that we try to cut through that. I think collaboration is key. So a lot of the content we make, for example, 2 years ago now, when Sri Lanka was undergoing a civil unrest with the Rajapaksa brothers, we told that story in news format, but we had a Sri Lankan comedian called Sereni host it. So we would have our team write it, but we would have her host it in the attempt to bridge two worlds that possibly wouldn't not necessarily see each other. And we've done that with a lot of different types of content. Additionally, we are diversifying the way that we try to tell stories. So we started as a news platform. So we did video content, then that became an article. We started doing articles. Then we started doing brand collaborations. probably the most successful of which was with Volvo, where we did one of their first Asian American spots that outperformed their other content by 4 times. They got 4 million views. And then now we're starting to find stories, write about them, and then turn that into IP that we then pitch to the likes of Apple or Hulu or Disney or whomever, and attach that with also Asian talent or Asian American talent. So we're sort of constantly iterating the way that we try to tell the stories and not being precious about. I think when a story needs to be told, we can't be precious about how it's told. We might start it off and we think it's going to be a photojournalism program, but it's actually better as a podcast. Or you might think it needs to be a documentary, but actually it's better as an article. And I think we have to sort of allow the story to come through in whatever form it needs to, and we're trying to do that iteratively with our own business as well.
Yeah, I also think like with Eastern Standard Times, like the platform itself, you guys have like a lot of local people just contribute their own content. So like, how have you guys tried to create a community for them, an environment where they can really thrive and have their work showcased?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we first started, and I'm very grateful that I get to lead the platform, but it wouldn't be what it is without the team that created it. So the head of production, Stephanie Tankulison, and then our head of one of our lead producers, Joy Jong, who came from CNN's Great Big Story. They had huge networks that we sort of employed immediately. And the thing we always go to people with is we don't come to people with commissions or briefs. We go to a producer, a writer, whomever. I think I've even done this with Tina, and sort of been like, what story do you wish you could tell? Or what story have you been denied that you've been pitching for days, weeks, months, years? We want to help you tell that story. And obviously, sometimes that requires a certain amount of storytelling skill and editing, but going to people and allowing people to tell, like, what is the most pressing story in Taiwan right now? Why would I know that? I live in New York City. You should tell me that. So that was the approach that we took. And I think that people, whether they're, a director or a gaffer, great stories come from anywhere. One of the best stories that we've told came from someone who worked on the tech side of our business, who was like, hey, I work on the tech side, but on the editorial side, can we tell this story? And he pitched this, he sort of was like, I know this person, his name is Hugh Min. And at one point, he was the biggest hacker in the world. He had stolen 2/3 of Americans' identities in the 2000s, and no one had ever told his story. And so, of course, like, that's an incredible story. Great stories can come from anywhere. So giving people the sort of dignity to believe that they can share their stories or other people's stories, I think, is foundational.
Thank you. Yeah. So I have a question for Tina. Besides your work in journalism, you're also serving as the president for the Asian American Journalists Association. So what are your goals for elevating the AAPI community and the newsroom, and how does this resonate with you as a storyteller?
Yeah, I think being a leader at AAJA in New York is definitely personal. Having a membership community where a lot of AAPI journalists are working so hard to get the story to be heard. This is definitely very important for me as a writer who often also covers the DI community. So I think my goal is pretty clear. First of all, it's definitely to establish a safe space for people like us to talk about their work struggles and to share some insights. But also, we do a lot of events and community building to really help the community. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we did a panel on how do we navigate the media industry. There are a lot of changes, there are a lot of layoffs right now. So, what are some ways that we can really use our journalism degree in other fields? So yeah, I think there are a lot of panels like that. Also, a health panel, and how do you navigate the neighborhood. So I think all those events together, and also adding on to all those fellowship and grants supporting emerging journalists, are really important for us as a group to elevate all those storytellers in the industry.
Thanks. I'll open the question up to all of you guys, actually. So, like, what are some changes that you would like to see in the local media or AAPI focus and ethnic media? Like, what are you looking for in the future, and what do you hope to see? You can take, yeah.
Once again. I mean, I think we all just want to see more representation across the board, right? And I feel like so many times, especially women, specifically us as women of color, it's like you get to be in the room but you're not really offered the chance to speak so much. So I want the opportunities for us to be able to comfortably speak up more, say the stories you want to say, and yeah, I think it always comes back to that for me.
Yeah, Keshia, do you? Okay.
I think that my hope for where we're going is, I totally agree with Azadeh. I think we need obviously more representation that looks like magnitude, but I also hope that we see a deepening of representation. And what I mean by that is that there's still sort of this, and we're very early, right? If we think about politically why this is the case, it was only in the 70s that the Chinese Exclusion Act ended. So many of our parents came, well, not mine, but many Asian American folks, their parents came in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so we are now the generation of decision making coming into our 30s, 40s, 50s. And I think that what that has meant is that there's been sort of quite a surface level representation. So, we'll go to a Lunar New Year event and there's going to be sort of mahjong and dumplings and we'll all see a lion dance and we'll go home, which is wonderful and important and we should celebrate. But there's so many more important conversations to be had and there's so many intersectional conversations to be had. So I'm excited for the nature of progress and the nature of gradualism that yes, we know we're here and we will celebrate, but what else can we do? Can we talk about the sort of rampant domestic abuse that exists in communities? Can we talk about the incredible authors that we have amongst our communities? I'm so glad that Daniel's book is here about as a mixed race author, but also about his story about Western and Chinese exchange. I want to see more of those stories. And so I'm excited for the deepening that isn't just sort of surface level or sometimes stereotypical, but how do we actually deepen and understand that being part of the Asian American community can mean so many different things and bringing representation to that.
I know, Tina, you mentioned some things, but if you wanted to keep.
I think adding on to what Keshia just said, our horror stories are, endless. It's not just timeless. It's not just from May, AAPI month. I think a lot of times editors or people who are actually in the leadership position, they don't really see the value for AAPI stories or underrepresented community stories. So we really have to educate editors or leaders in a way that to tell them, hey, our stories matter in a way.
Well, I feel like we can open it up to questions from the audience if anybody has any. Otherwise, I can ask one more. Oh, there's a question in the back.
Hi, thanks. My name is Ray Shah. I live here. As you can probably tell, I'm from the UK originally. And what I find is that if I just listen to local media, I tend to get a very myopic sense of what's going on. So my question for Keshia is, if you're only recruiting local news, sourcing news from local people, then where's the perspective coming from?
I guess that the sort of what's hidden in that question is that there is a myopic nature to local stories. I think that local stories have a really important impact on the way that people perceive global issues. So I don't think that telling only a local story means that you're only going to kind of focus on one issue. You can tell a local story and tell many different kinds of stories. So, for example, in New York, you can tell a story about what's happening in Queens, which will be completely different to what's happening in Lower Manhattan. So I think what is important in telling local stories or global stories is just making sure that we are truly telling multiple sides of the story. And I think that's what we try to do. Our focus is not necessarily to sort of align with mainstream topics. We think that mainstream topics are covered. We created EST to tell the stories that aren't told. So we are biased in that way, and I personally think objectivity is a myth. I don't think that anybody is truly objective because even the idea of objectivity has bias to it. So we sort of allow people to lean into their biases or their perspectives, but to name them at the beginning. And I think by doing so, we allow more perspectives to be told.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
I guess I'll just ask everybody a hotline question. What are you doing to tackle misinformation more? And sorry if I wasn't touched on it, but I really want to hear more on that in your news organizations and just in the greater global.
Yeah, I can speak quickly to the ways that we try to do that. I mean, I think that firstly, there's such an interesting conflation happening right now between social media creators and journalists. And I think people think that we sort of do the same thing. And I personally really like social media. I think it's given voice to a number of different perspectives that we wouldn't have heard from before. But I do think that it's really important to remember that journalists are held to very specific standards. And if we are ever misrepresenting something, we are legally liable for that in a way that a creator is not. So I think first, we continue to uphold journalistic standards. I think what also I try to really be careful about, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent. Hopefully, Michelle answers your question. But I think, when I think about something like Stop AAPI Hate, which obviously is extremely important, and we've done a number of documentaries and reporting about it. I think something that people overlook sometimes is the way that we represent those facts. So, for example, in 2023, of the total hate crimes that were conducted in 2023, 27.5 were against Asian Americans, and 52.5%, 27.5% were toward Asian Americans, 52.5% were against the Black community. And I think that's something that we fail to sort of articulate. So it's not, sorry? 27.5 was against the Asian community, 52.5 was against the Black community. The Black community has consistently been the most victimized by hate crimes historically and continues till today by a magnitude of at least 50%. So I think misinformation is not something that I'm necessarily combating in the world. It's something that we hold true to in our newsroom. But I think additionally, what we can do as a community is to make sure that we're representing any kind of issue and bringing everyone alongside us so that, to the gentleman's point, that we don't become myopic, but that we become inclusive and that we all sort of rise together. A little bit of a tangent, but something that I feel is important for us to name.
Building off of what Keshia said, that's exactly it. I think you nailed it with that. And it's really about accuracy and holding up to that journalistic integrity. Something I tell my team a lot too is we might not be the first to report it, but we're going to be the right ones. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think besides reporting with facts, which we all know, but I think it's also important to reporting with empathy. As a reporter of color, you have these advantage, I would say, to really learn from different diverse perspective because you are one of those women of color or people of color. So you have this edge of, really understanding and reporting with care. So when you are going, on an interview with like people who are different from you, with different background, really to understand what their perspective is. So I think empathy is really what get me going to this day. Yeah.
There's a question in the back.
Oh yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. It was great to hear you today. My name is Chip. I've worked in media and communication for a very long time, and this. So I should come with a very in-depth question. But I don't have an in-depth question. What I would like to know from your varied perspective, where are you consuming your media from? What are the places that you're finding your information, personally and professionally? I think we have an advantage. You have an advantage. We have an advantage as journalists of color to have a much wider pool that we pick from, right? That's one of the criticisms that we watch mainstream media. You're like, where are you getting your information from? Like the same two sources. So I would love for you to share with us where you're getting your information. What do you enjoy reading, and where do you get that information from?
Yeah, I would love to put forward, if you're into pop cultures, like me, I would love to put forward Joy Sauce, which is a publication centered around API culture in the arts world.
I kind of have a mix. So definitely social media, but very localized, on the ground, community, kind of what you were hitting on. Because there's people out there who have stories and they're living lives and they're really sharing them. And it's important that we pay attention. So that's definitely one. As far as, more, I guess, professional news sources, it's hard to, yeah, it's hard to really narrow it down, but I try to get a variety, from The Guardian and Al Jazeera to Washington Post. Just, you kind of want to keep a pulse on everything that's going on, but also to pay attention to how things are being reported and how the headlines are being worded specifically.
That's a beautiful question, Chip. Thank you for asking it. My gold standard of journalism is Democracy Now! I think that they continue to report both locally and globally in an extremely steadfast and thorough way. So that's probably the thing I consume the most. And then, sort of to Azadeh's point, I think I try to do sort of the polars of, you know, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then local like New York City Focus, etc. And then also, honestly, like I subscribe to, more left-leaning newsletters like Anand Giridharadas, who is a former journalist who wrote Winners Take All, an economist. He has an amazing newsletter that I think is extremely center-left in terms of how it reports on politics and economics. But then I subscribe to some pretty far right-leaning newsletters that make my blood boil. But I think it's important that we understand how things are being phrased and how they're being turned, because it helps us to make sure our stories are sort of insulated against that. So I think, I think that we all know about the social media bubble and the sort of way that we can end up in echo chambers. We have to actively fight against that. We have to actively go out and subscribe to the things that make you angry, or subscribe to the sort of bizarre thought processes that can be potentially oppressive. But we need to understand how people are thinking so that we can try to create something that hopefully, people are going to believe what they're going to believe, but we can try our hardest to try and be informed about why they believe that, so that we can sort of reverse engineer some sort of solution or truth.
I think. Okay, so time.
Sure. There's a great Chinese saying that I really love, which is 屁股决定脑袋. It means your butt kind of decides how you think, where you sit determines where you stand. And you guys have been talking about this issue. I guess um, you kind of realize with even in the U.S., even within one society, kind of Trump supporters versus non-Trump supporters just have a different view of the world, right? So it's not even a fact. We're about to enter a world where geopolitically, probably the most important geopolitical conflict will be between China and the U.S. And people who grow up in one society will see things very differently. Like to most of the world, I was in Israel last year. To most of the world, Israel is very simple. It's a strong country oppressing a weaker group of people. But if you don't grow up, if your butt isn't there, in like the global south, right, you may not understand that. So anyway, the point of my question is how do you guys have you guys thought about this? Like even how we cover things is very important. How do you break through? Not just seeing left and right. I can always subscribe to a right newspaper, but how do I get my butt to move? Yeah, or how do you show people a different way of thinking?
I feel like that question also talks about, do you ever care about your audience when you are writing about, like, do you ever think about your target audience when you're writing about them? So I feel like for me, I actually don't think about my target audience, but I would say if you're really reporting with truth and empathy, you don't really need to, because your stories speak for yourself. And for example, I was actually covering the election and administration for API magazine, and then I was kind of worried that my article is like leaning towards like one side rather than another. But I would say, if you have the two sides, like both sides reported well and with facts, you don't really need to worry about, whether your story is for one or the other.
Yeah, I think back to what you said about empathy. I think you definitely need empathy. Also, again, to your point that you just made, if you're presenting facts truthfully, you don't need to fight for it. However, to answer your question, which if I'm not mistaken, I understand it, it's how to connect with people, and it's finding that connection with them. If you want to, I guess, what is your goal with the story you're telling? or what the information that you're trying to put out, right? If it's just to inform people, you know, you want it factual, truthful, just enough empathy there. But if you're trying to change their mind, I mean, to convince anybody of anything, this goes beyond journalism, you need to find a connection first. And as you mentioned, like Trump supporters and whatnot, he was able to connect with them, right? That's why they're so loyal, right? Because they have that connection. May not be very correct all the time and make our blood boil up here, but I mean, that's how it happened. So if you want to help change people's minds or open their minds to new things, you have to find a way to connect with them. I think that goes back to the point you made about empathy.
I think it's such a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think I spend my life and career trying to understand how we can change people's minds and hearts. And I think that there is not one industry that can do that. I think probably the biggest industry that can do that is the psychotherapy one. And I think there's a lot of unhealth in people, which is where a lot of this comes from. But I think to give a more practical, hopefully, answer, I think, there's two things I think about when you ask that question. The first is that facts are facts, right? So if I'm thinking about the conflict between the US and China, as somebody who is extremely sensitive to xenophobia and somebody who grew up in Hong Kong, so is extremely, I have a lot of love for Chinese culture, Cantonese culture, and Chinese culture writ large. There is a very clear track record of human rights abuses by the Chinese government. That doesn't, in so many ways, it's emancipated its population, but in many other ways, there's no sort of promise of human rights and sort of like equality for the whole world. So that's obviously simplification, but in that way, I think it's important that we can hold two truths, right? That I may not agree with the CCP, but I'm not going to hold any kind of hate or discrimination against Chinese people. So there's a factual element to that. And I think that ties into what the second part is, what I'd say is, the humanization of stories. And I think about the genocide in Gaza, and I think about how there was an infuriating opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning or yesterday that still sort of represented the threat of Hamas as a reason why people should be slaughtered and obliterated. But I think that No Other Land, the documentary that won the Oscar this year, that was showing at BAM and a couple of other theaters in New York that had a very, very difficult time getting distributed, was an incredible story that didn't, if you've been watching social media, unfortunately, doesn't show you anything new about the horrors that Palestinians are facing. However, it humanized it in a person and a character that I believe people will be able to connect to empathetically, as folks are mentioning, in a way that if you haven't grown up with that, if you've been given sort of, whether you are Israeli and you don't understand the environment that you've been raised in. I was raised in Australia. That is a settler colony. We are American people who are not indigenous to this land. I think the majority of us, we are settlers here. So there are things that we don't grow up learning and knowing, but there are things that we can educate ourselves about. And I think that's where the sort of fact and humanization need to work in sort of tandem with each other. That's what I've seen change people's hearts and minds the most.
Well, thank you guys, all of you, for your time. This is our panel. I just wanted to give a brief thank you to the Serica Initiative and AAJA for hosting this and putting this conference together. I also hope that the audience checks out two incredible publications, Envi Media and Eastern Standard Times Media. If you were asking about what to read, I mean, these are two great sources to already check out now. It's so important now more than ever that we uplift these independent publications that give voice to underrepresented communities. Let me wrap up sincerely by thanking the panelists for their time today, and let's give them a final round of applause.